Hi everyone, so today's video is going to be a craft video, and that's going to be on my favorite dialogue technique, and that is writing in the subtext. A few times on my channel I've mentioned that I really enjoy this technique of writing in the subtext, writing two conversations at once, what is being said versus what's not being said, and I guess I mentioned that in my Q&A video, my most recent Q&A. Someone left a comment on there asking if I could make a video on this. In that video I had mentioned that they do that a lot in Hannibal. So in today's video, I'm going to be showing you an example of writing in the subtext using examples from NBC show Hannibal, which if you haven't watched it, my examples are only from episode 1 and they're not spoilery, I don't think. This can be applied whether or not you're writing a script or if you're writing prose. Personally, I use this technique a lot in my prose. Quick disclaimer, I basically made everything up in this video. So none of the terms necessarily really exist. So if you Google it, you may not find anything because it's just stuff that I've thought of. Not only do you have to get a handle on writing what you are in the fictive present, you also have to create an alternate timeline that is a little bit buried and staggered behind it. So it is difficult, and the context necessary if you don't know what the show is. So Hannibal's a TV show following Will Graham, an unorthodox profiler who's enlisted by the FBI to help profile and hopefully catch a serial killer that goes by the name of the Minnesota Shrike. Hannibal Lecter is a psychiatrist and is brought in by Will's superior, Jack Crawford, to write up a profile of Will himself. So let's roll the clip. It's about 3 minutes, and after that we'll talk about the techniques that are going on in the dialogue.
Good morning, Will. May I come in?
Where's Crawford?
Deposed in court. The adventure will be yours and mine today. May I come in? I'm very careful about what I put into my body, which means I end up preparing most meals myself. A little protein scramble to start the day. Some eggs, some sausage.
That's delicious, thank you.
My pleasure. I would apologize for my analytical ambush, but I know I will soon be apologizing again, and you'll tire of that eventually, so I have to consider using apologies sparingly.
Just keep it professional.
Oh, we could socialize like adults. God forbid we become friendly.
I don't find you that interesting.
You will. Agent Crawford tells me I have a knack for the monsters.
I don't think the Shrike killed that girl on the field.
The devil is in the details. What didn't your copycat do to the girl in the field? What gave it away?
Everything. It's like he had to show me a negative so that I could see the positive. That crime scene was practically gift-wrapped.
The mathematics of human behavior. All those ugly variables. Some bad math with this Shrike fellow, huh? Are you reconstructing his fantasies? What kind of problems does he have?
He has a few.
Ever have any problems, Will?
No.
Of course you don't. You and I are just alike. Problem-free. Nothing about us to feel horrible about. You know, Will? I think Uncle Jack sees you as a fragile little teacup. The finest china used for only special guests.
How do you see me?
The mongoose I went under the house when the snake slid by. Finish your breakfast.
So what is subtext? We can view subtext as what is not being said in a conversation or the narrative, anything that basically has words. So subtext is what is not being explored, but what is being said at the same time. So all conversations often have subtext, even if we don't really notice it. So the actual conversation would be the text versus the subtext, which would be what is not actually being said. So we can view the text as reality, as close as possible to what we are currently experiencing, versus subtext, which is almost an alternate reality. What is not being said, but what contributes to what is occurring anyway. So subtext is a bit of a tricky thing to understand. I like to think of it as what is not being said, but what is still just as important as what is being said. So now let's jump into analyzing this script. So note, this is not literary analysis, which is like a technique in English, and that would be looking to analyze content for meaning. I'm analyzing content for technique. All right, so let's look at how the script starts. So as you can tell, it starts pretty innocuously. The first topic of conversation is, and we'll take a look at my markup, small talk. So the dialogue starts on a pretty mundane note. Hannibal says, "Good morning." Will says, well, Will doesn't actually say anything nice in return. He just kind of asks a question. Then Hannibal's like, "May I come in?" It's not really anything interesting. It is just small talk. So after this mundane interaction, we get to this part in the script where Hannibal starts setting up breakfast. And this is a homemade breakfast because he's brought it in Tupperware, and so that detail is given to us. So this is where our first subject change occurs. As you can see, we subject change to food, which is prompted by the object. So Hannibal begins talking about the food, which is, "I'm very careful about what I put into my body," which is prompted by opening up these Tupperware containers. So his dialogue is really fascinating here because learning from the subtext, us as viewers who have more information on who Hannibal Lecter is, who's a cannibal in pop culture, we recognize that that dialogue is a bit sinister. So something I want you to notice in this dialogue is that there's no filler here. So Hannibal only speaks when actions necessitate that speaking. So he uses action otherwise to fill the empty space. So an example of filler might have been while he's setting up, he could say, "Will, I brought you breakfast. I made it myself. These are the ingredients. I hope you don't have allergies." Something that's filler. But the writers are doing something really important here by reserving the dialogue for when it is absolutely necessary. So a viewer is more inclined to pay attention, and we also understand that this piece of dialogue holds a lot more weight because it's the first time that they're really saying anything of importance beyond the small talk that they started with. After this part of the script, we move to this part and we go back to small talk. But this time the small talk is a little bit modified, and the modification is in the highlighted line. He is genuinely amused and successfully hides it. So the modification here is Hannibal's dialogue of "my pleasure." So that is actually genuine. So the modification of "my pleasure," while it sounds like regular small talk on the outside, the subtext is telling us my pleasure actually has a little bit of amusement hiding behind it. So the dialogue of "my pleasure" is atypical of usually neutral small talk. So this is just a subtle little beat of subtext of Hannibal saying "my pleasure." What he isn't saying is, "It's my pleasure because I'm probably feeding you human." Now we're going to move into probably the most difficult and heavily subtextual part of this conversation. So this may be overwhelming to look at first. So this is the markup. It is overwhelming. Let's break it down first with the blue. So the subject has changed once again to Hannibal's apology, but this time there's more subtextual provoking. To understand that subtextual provocation, we need to first understand two terms. So the terms I want to define for you right now are topical meaning and actual meaning. So topical meaning is what the speaker means, quote unquote. It's usually a guise for something else, which is oftentimes the subtext. It's not fully honest. It's a bit withholding on the page, versus the actual meaning is what the speaker truly means. So this could be viewed as the truth. So as you can see, the blue is the topical meaning. Hannibal's topical dialogue is, "I would apologize for my analytical ambush, but I know I will soon be apologizing again." This is kind of politeness, it's not exactly what he means, and you'll see when we get to another line of dialogue why I've come to that conclusion. Will's response naturally to Hannibal's topical dialogue is just keep it professional. So then we get to the yellow. The yellow is the actual meaning. So Hannibal's next dialogue to respond to Will is, or we could socialize like adults, God forbid we become friendly. So here, Hannibal utilizes a charged phrase, and that is like adults, and that's almost how you can tell that it's his actual meaning. So charged phrases often incite honesty. Will follows up with a response to the actual meaning by giving an actual response himself. His response is, I don't find you that interesting. And that's what he actually means, versus if we go back to the previous slide, just keep it professional. Will is actually trying to say, I don't find you that interesting. So whatever you're trying to do by profiling me or getting in my head doesn't really matter to me because you are very boring to me. Versus what Hannibal is saying, I want to apologize for ambushing you. I don't want to say sorry too many times because I know that I'm going to be saying sorry a lot in the future. What Hannibal actually means is, I don't really know why we can't just talk like adults or even be friends. And you see that actually unfold on the page. So the next line is this orange line of you will. This actually seems to be a nonsensical response that holds no current weight, but may foreshadow the future. That's why it's important, because currently, you will? What does that have to do with the conversation? You will find me interesting? That doesn't really have anything to do with the conversation at hand until we realize as readers that might be projecting into the future, which it does. It really does. So now we're going to get into this purple area. And so this purple line is particularly interesting because it links back with the previous yellow line from Will. So if we remove the line you will from the mix, so just ignore that it's there, Hannibal's response of Agent Crawford tells me you have a knack for the monsters could be seen as a subtextual response to Will's I don't find you that interesting. So the dialogue almost works like a poetic line break in this section, with Hannibal's line building off of what Will has said. So this line is a subtextual response to Will's true meaning that may hold thematic weight. It seems like a random subject change, but is actually thematically charged. So with the context that Hannibal Lecter is a serial killer and cannibal, which viewers are kind of led into very early on in this episode, we can view this line of Agent Crawford tells me you have a knack for the monsters as a direct response to I don't find you that interesting. Because Hannibal could be saying, but you should find me interesting because I am one of the monsters. That's what the subtext is telling us. And obviously that's not what is being said to Will, so he doesn't know that. Us as viewers have that context, so we're let into what the subtext is trying to say. So then we get to this part of the script, which is pretty interesting because then we're deflecting to facts. So previously, in this slide, we're seeing a bit more of a personal conversation, and I think Will is getting uncomfortable with having to talk about his opinion about Hannibal Lecter. He doesn't really care about that right now. So instead of actually addressing Agent Crawford tells me you have a knack for the monsters, whatever that means, Will deflects to the facts. Will ignores all that Hannibal has said and goes straight to business. They have a relatively normal conversation for a few lines. So Will's like, I don't think the Shrike killed that girl in the field. Hannibal's like, the devil's in the details. What didn't your copycat do to the girl in the field? What gave it away? This is a pretty normal conversation. There's nothing happening in the subtext here, and we can tell because there are no strange lines that seem out of place. It's just kind of a regular back and forth. Then we get to this part of the script, and this is interesting because we move into this teal section, which I've named double meaning. So this is the 7th time we've changed the subject in this conversation. Here we introduce a double meaning. So Hannibal asks, are you reconstructing his fantasies talking about Shrike the serial killer? What kind of problems does he have? Which is Hannibal's topical meaning, which is kind of what you're expecting. So Will says he has a few. And then we get to Hannibal's actual meaning, which is, ever have any problems, Will? So Hannibal is not actually caring to know the answer about the Shrike, and this is confirmed when he asks his actual meaning to Will, ever have any problems? So when we get to this section, we might be able to understand why this conversation is occurring in the first place, and if you're not picking up on it, I will get to it in just a second. Note the lines of the mirroring here, asking what kinds of problems does the serial killer have, and then asking Will, do you have any problems? Knowing that Hannibal's job is to profile Will for the FBI. Then we move to this section of the script, which is the gray, purple, and pink section. So in this one small section, we cycle through 3 different subjects. So gray is a short intermission from the previous conversation as Hannibal likens himself to Will. So the previous thing Will said was no, and he responds by saying, "Of course you don't. You and I are just alike." So he kind of diverges a little bit. And this diverging could also be a subtextual trigger, trying to tell the viewer this might hold thematic weight for later, which I think it does if you've watched the show. Then Hannibal brings up Jack seemingly out of nowhere in a while with the dialogue. "I think Uncle Jack sees you as a fragile little teacup, the finest china used for only special guests." So this is kind of profiling Jack while also profiling how maybe Jack would profile Will. What's important about this purple dialogue is that it provokes the conversation's thesis, with Will asking, "How do you see me?" This question exposes Will's subtextual interest / why the conversation occurs in the first place, as well as Hannibal's motivations for starting the conversation. Hannibal is trying to profile Will, and Will now wants to know what he thinks, which is different from how he reacted in the past. Then we get into the final lines of the scene. And so this is the green and red section. So the green is actually the 11th time we've changed this subject in this conversation, and that is the exposure of truth. This is an exposure of truth where Hannibal brings up the mongoose metaphor. This is one of the most intense parts of the conversation because it's incredibly close to reality, and whatever's closer to reality is farther away from the subtext, because subtext is the reality, but subtext isn't what is being projected into reality. What we're saying is being projected into reality. And so subtext is kind of alternate reality, right? Because subtext has driven this conversation, being sharply brought back into reality in Hannibal's genuine opinion is nearly shocking. So that makes sense as to why the end of this conversation mirrors the beginning, and we go back to the small talk to let that intense moment settle upon us. So the screenwriters are doing something really interesting here by making the second last lines, "The mongoose I want under the house when the snakes slither by," which is his opinion of Will, be immediately juxtaposed by this kind of boring, mundane small talk, and that's how the scene ends with "finish your breakfast." So there's nothing really that interesting about that line, but what is interesting is what it's doing to give breathing room for that mongoose line to really fester in the minds of viewers. Now that we've gone over this scene, I want to talk about a few things that subtextual conversations should have, and you can pick and choose what you want to include in your own dialogue. You definitely don't need to have all. When you're having all, it can get a little bit intense. I will note that writing in the subtext is a really tricky thing, and sometimes even people who are really great at it, like the writers of Hannibal, can fall back a little bit because they get too buried in the subtext to the point where a conversation could be almost impossible to understand, because talking in subtext is almost like talking in a love language between two different people who understand that subtext. It can be polarizing for viewers or readers who don't understand that language. I do it all the time when I'm writing my own book, where my characters, 2 of them, will understand each other very well, so they can talk in subtext to each other, but a reader might not completely understand what is happening. So keep that in mind. I think that these are elements that subtextual conversations should include. The first is rhythm. So we constantly change ideas and subjects, cross-directing the conversation's flow to reveal something about the relationship at hand. So in this case, the subtext reveals a few things about Will and Hannibal's relationship, most notably Hannibal's attractive curiosity of Will. So that's why at the end of this conversation, we bounce back between like 12 different subjects. Sometimes you don't understand why somebody's changing a conversation to fit this direction, but when we consider the subtext, it all makes a little bit more sense and it all comes together. So rhythm's a huge one. The second is padding. So padding is parts of a conversation that are not directly related to the speaker's calculated intent, but that herd the conversation to the eventual end. So the example here for me is the conversation starting on the breakfast, which reveals something about Hannibal. He only eats food he cooks, and we already know he's a cannibal. So what does that mean? The subtext here is that he does this because he's a cannibal, and that adds texture to the narrative depth as his cannibalism becomes more relevant to the show. Padding is not unnecessary dialogue, I should note that, but rather calculated jabs that seem irrelevant but that actually hold incredible thematic weight. So that also includes the line, "you will." Things that seem off at first but are actually calculated, They have intent behind them. So the next thing that subtextual conversations often include are subtle responses or conversations within conversations. Will says, "I don't find you that interesting," and almost immediately after, Hannibal says, "Agent Crawford tells me you have a knack for the monsters." So what's not being said here is, "So therefore you should have a knack for me because I am also a monster." And that's why the line works so well both in the content and in the positioning it occurs in the conversation. Hannibal suddenly responds to Will without him even realizing it. So subtext can also be where you put the dialogue. So the writer's putting "Agent Crawford tells me you have a knack for the monsters" right after Will says, "I don't find you that interesting," has a lot of subtextual weight. So the next thing that these conversations will include are charged phrases. So these often reveal the truth. Or we could socialize like adults. Like adults is a charged phrase, and it suggests Will is not acting like an adult. So it reveals Hannibal's true opinion of Will. Charged phrases incite honesty, even if this honesty is just in a 2-word phrase. Charged phrases is not to say mean phrases, so people going at each other and saying things they don't mean. A charged phrase is what you do mean, and it can be very subtle, like adults. So subtext is like the subconscious, conscious versus subconscious. So Hannibal saying "like adults" is triggering a viewer's subconscious to feel a certain way about Will, or at least how Hannibal views Will right now. So the next thing that occurs in subtextual conversations are misdirected questions. So a great example of this is, "Are you reconstructing his fantasies? What kind of problems does he have?" And then we get the misdirected question of, "Ever have any problems?" The "are you reconstructing his fantasies? What kind of problems does he have?" is misdirected. So that is actually directed at the Shrike. But we understand when we get to "ever have any problems, Will?" that this is actually what Hannibal has been trying to ask. He doesn't care about the Minnesota Shrike. He's trying to ask about Will. You can't really trust questions in heavily subtextual conversations. At first we're expecting Hannibal's question to be directed toward the Shrike, but when we realize as viewers that he's actually asking Will this question, the state of the conversation is revealed. It leads us to the next point, which is thematic realizations. So misdirected questions often lead to thematic realizations because they reveal something about the asked and the intentions of the asker, and the intentions are where the subtext lies. In this case, a viewer may begin to understand that Hannibal is attempting to finish the work he started at the beginning of the episode, where he tries to inadvertently profile Will. Remember, his whole job is that he's hired to profile Will, so that's what he's trying to do in this scene. Hannibal's conclusion about this profiling is that Will is the mongoose he wants under the house when the snakes slither by. So this phrase holds thematic bearing because it reveals something about Will's character for being described in this way, and Hannibal's character for coming to this conclusion, and that is the subtext. These realizations, as hinted at previously, also reveal the conversation's thesis, which is the next point that we're going to be talking about. The thesis is the central reason that a conversation occurs, even if the characters themselves don't realize it. "How do you see me?" which Will says toward the end of the conversation, is the thesis here, as the rest of the conversation's previous occurrence is contextualized by it. We must now, as viewers, reassess everything that has been said, because it may potentially have been subtextually about Will and not the Minnesota Shrike. The final thing that all subtextual conversations will have is tension. So all of these elements combine to create a bizarre, almost indescribable, unpinnable tension throughout a conversation when used correctly. So it's often hard to understand why a conversation may make you feel uneasy, and a lot of the techniques that I just mentioned are why. And this is why subtextual conversations like this can really cure two people in a room talking syndrome. The scene that we just watched is literally two people talking in a room. But why is it interesting, people might ask? There's so much subtextual excavation occurring that it just can't not be interesting. It reveals so much about both characters that we don't need a whole bunch of stuff to be going on to still enjoy and take away something from the scene. Subtext is often how you can create subtle writing. So if you've ever been trying to include more subtlety in your work, subtext is how you can go about doing it. What is not being said that is just as important as what is being said. Like I said, it's really tricky. I wouldn't expect beginner writers to try to do this because it can get clarity problems galore. But if you are a little bit more of an intermediate writer who's trying to play around with timeline psychology and obviously subtext versus the text itself, this is a really great way to do it. Like I said before, subtext and text mirror subconscious and conscious. So there's a lot more psychological weight when we're playing around with subtext in conversations. So that's gonna be my video on how you can write in the subtext. I hope that this makes sense. I use this technique all the time in dialogue. I will see you guys in another video. Bye.